Right now, you are treating a running inner voice as if it were the owner of your life. That single, almost automatic assumption, this voice is me, is quietly organizing what you notice, how you behave, and even what opportunities come into view. That sounds dramatic, but you don't have to take my word for it. Do this. Pause where you are and try not to think for 60 seconds. Not don't think about problems or don't feel. Just notice the voice and try not to agree with it for about a minute. See what happens to your body, to your breathing, to the sense of I that usually sits behind the thoughts. If you can, stop reading and try it now. If you can't pause, keep listening and do the same exercise the moment you can. This is the single, simplest, most revealing test in the whole 6-week program I'll outline across this series. When you do that short experiment, a few things will usually show up. First, thoughts will continue to appear. You won't be able to stop them all, and that's the point. Thoughts arise spontaneously, like weather. Second, there's a difference between the voice and the part of you that notices the voice. You might realize you're not the thought itself, you're the space noticing the thought. Third, once you stop reflexively buying into every thought, the urgency of many of them subsides. That felt easing is not imaginary. It's the very first immediate sign that what you identify with, the narrator, is optional. Pause now, do the 60-second test if you didn't already, and notice what changed even a little. If that experiment landed for you in any meaningful way, stay with me. If it didn't, that's fine too. This skill is learnable, and the rest of this talk is built to make the insight increasingly stable. The reason this matters is practical and profound. Identification shapes behavior. When you take the narrator as the self, you treat every thought like a command, a prophecy, or a personal truth. That makes you reactive, defensive, and constrained by patterns formed long ago. When you instead recognize the thought as content, an event in awareness, not the owner of awareness, you open a gap, and in that gap, new responses become possible. What you notice shifts, what you attend to expands, and the small decisions you make in each moment begin to differ. Over time, those small differences accumulate, and what we call reality changes in predictable ways. You notice different opportunities, you respond differently to people, stress takes a different shape, creativity returns in places it had been blocked. Let me offer a very brief scientific frame so this doesn't sound purely poetic. Decades ago, Benjamin Libet and other researchers raised a question that wasn't meant to disempower you, but to illuminate how awareness works. Decisions and mental content often begin in brain activity before they reach conscious awareness. Put plainly, the brain is a prediction machine. It continuously anticipates what is about to happen, what you will see, what you will do, what you will think, and presents those predictions as the now. That predictive processing is efficient, but it also creates the sense that thoughts spontaneously belong to you. Neuroscience suggests this background predictive activity builds the flow of experience, and metacognitive awareness, the ability to notice the thinking itself, creates a small but crucial delay. That delay is your window. Use this window. It's where the 60-second experiment lives, and it's where all practical change begins. Think of your mind as a radio. Stations, thoughts, constantly play. Most people live convinced the station is the house, but awareness is the receiver, the room in which the radio sits, and sometimes the room is quiet even while stations change. When you learn you are the room, not the music no longer determines your mood or decisions the same way. Imagine a common scene. You're heading into a tough conversation. The inner voice starts, "What if they criticize you? Say something safe. You'll sound dumb." If you simply obey those phrases, the conversation will be cautious, defensive, and shaped by avoidance. If instead you notice the voice as a sequence of images, memories, and predictions, label it as forecast or old fear, you buy a gap. In that gap, you can respond with curiosity, with questions, without dissolving into reactivity. The content of the conversation changes. The same external event, someone giving feedback, yields a different internal response and therefore a different relational outcome. Now let's build a practical pathway you can start today. The rest of this message will lay out the first phases, the initial experiments, and the 2 foundational practices that create the most leverage early on. I'll give you step-by-step instructions, clear durations, simple metrics to track progress, and vivid examples so you can apply this in real life. We're starting with 3 essentials: the 60-second noticing experiment you already tried, a daily practice called thought labeling, and a slightly longer tracking work called source tracing. These 3 create the metacognitive gap and begin to loosen habit-bound identity. Thought labeling. 5 minutes daily for 7 days. Every time a thought arises during a short, dedicated window, give it a short descriptive label. Not "I shouldn't have said that" in a condemning way, but regret, rating, prediction, story, memory, advice, fear, comforting. The goal is not to stop the thought or to judge it. The goal is to distinguish content from the knower. Labeling does 2 things. First, it externalizes the thought. By naming it, you make it an object, not a self-evident truth. Second, it trains your brain to notice categories of thinking, which speeds up metacognition. Over a week, you'll notice labels begin to appear automatically, and the voice loses some of its automatic pull. How to do thought labeling in 5 minutes. Sit quietly with a soft, steady breath. Set a timer for 5 minutes. Bring your attention to the stream of thinking, whatever arrives. Each time you notice a thought, say a single word label silently: worry, plan, blame, judgment. Don't analyze the thought. Don't try to eliminate it. Just label and return to open awareness. After a week, do 1 longer session of 10 minutes and track how many times you labeled thoughts compared to the first day. You can record a simple metric: day 1 labels per 5-minute session versus day 7 labels. Most people see labeling frequency go down as noticing becomes quicker and the gap widens. The felt intensity of certain recurring thoughts will reduce. Let me give you a short vignette. Maria, a project manager in her 30s, began the labeling practice during a high-pressure release window at work. Her recurring thought, "You'll mess this up," used to hijack her mornings with dread. For a week, she labeled every thought that rose during a 5-minute sit: worry, future pacing, punishment story. On day 3, she realized the thought, "You'll mess this up," was connected to a memory of criticism from a former manager 8 years earlier. By naming the class of thought, memory trigger, and seeing it as content, she created enough distance to choose a different behavior. Instead of replaying the fear, she rehearsed a clear, small next step. The immediate benefit wasn't that the project became risk-free, it was that her energy and attention were no longer monopolized by a past voice, and that allowed her to think more creatively and communicate more clearly. The second foundational practice is source tracing, a more investigative protocol to map repetitive thoughts to their origins. Do this for 14 days, spending roughly 10 to 15 minutes each day on focused tracing. The exercise is deceptively simple. When a recurring thought arises, especially one that carries strong emotion, trace backward until you find the first time you remember feeling something similar. Often the original incident is earlier and smaller than the current replay suggests. Many persistent narratives are echoes from childhood, cultural messages, or inherited family scripts. When you connect a present haunting thought to a specific origin event, the thought loses authority. It becomes an echo rather than a directive. Practical steps for source tracing. Keep a small notebook or digital note labeled source tracing. When a pattern shows, say, "I'm not enough around smart people," write down the thought, the immediate trigger, who, what, where, and then ask yourself, what does this thought remind me of? When have I felt similarly before? Spend a few minutes recalling a concrete memory, an image, a smell, a location. Write that memory down and then annotate how the memory may have created a rule, like, "If I'm not perfect, I'll be criticized," that now plays out as daily mental chatter. Do this for 1 to 3 recurring thoughts each day. A short example. Daniel kept feeling anxious when his partner wanted to discuss finances. He labeled the thought shame multiple times and then did a tracing session. He remembered a childhood scene where a parent lost composure during an unexpected bill and blamed him for not understanding. Once he wrote the memory into the tracing notebook and described the rule it implied, "Money mistakes bring emotional storms," he could test that rule in a small way. Speak one non-defensive sentence about money and observe the partner's actual response. The result wasn't a guaranteed smooth conversation, it was information that contradicted the old rule. The internal narrative, once externalized, had less gravitational pull. Important: source tracing is investigative, not therapeutic replacement. You may find strong emotions tied to early memories. If tracing opens deep wounds or persistent trauma, consider doing the work with professional support. The tracing itself is a data gathering and reality checking exercise, not a substitute for therapy. Its primary function is to reduce the unconscious authority of recurring thoughts by revealing where they began. After you do thought labeling and source tracing for their recommended windows, you'll have built an evidence base, noticeable reductions in thought intensity, a clearer ability to create a gap, and a map of where your most persuasive narratives started. That's a huge shift already. But the next step is to anchor identity in awareness itself, not just in noticing thoughts. Awareness anchoring is the bridge between momentary recognition and a sustained identity shift. Awareness anchor practice is exactly what it sounds like, a deliberate habituation to the felt sense of being the space of awareness. Do this 10 minutes twice daily for 2 weeks. Sit or stand comfortably. Soften your gaze. Bring attention to the felt sense of presence, the subtle sense that is aware of seeing, hearing, thinking. You can use a simple phrase if it helps, like, "I am the space noticing," or rely on the felt quality alone. The practice is not about doing more thinking, it's about resting as the knower. When thoughts intrude, simply notice and return to the anchor. A common metaphor I use: imagine your attention as a lighthouse beam swinging across a shoreline of thoughts. When you anchor awareness, the beam stays steady. Thoughts still move along the shore, but the lamp doesn't get pulled into each wave. Over weeks, the lighthouse steadiness becomes your baseline. Small tests will make this apparent. Try walking into a mildly stressful situation, an email you expect criticism for, a brief call with a demanding colleague, and notice whether you can hold the anchor while engaging. Initially, it will wobble. With consistent practice, it becomes more stable, and the quality of your responses changes. Now, pause for a moment and reflect. You've just done a brief noticing experiment, learned why the brain's predictive habits make thoughts feel like ownership, and been given 2 practical tools to widen the metacognitive gap. Many listeners at this point feel a mix of curiosity and skepticism. That's healthy. What I want to stress is that this work is not a promise of instant external miracles. It's an invitation to test, measure, and iterate. The immediate shift you felt in the 60-second exercise, less identification, a softer sense of I, is the same mechanism that, amplified by these practices, begins to shape your daily reality. Before we continue, one practical ask. If that 60-second experiment landed for you, pause now and tell someone or type into your notes what felt different. This is the simple early CTA. Notice, then record. That act of recording anchors the subjective shift into an external metric and increases follow-through. If you're watching a video, pause and do that note. If you're listening, make a quick voice memo. This single step, notice then log, sets the tone for the reality response journal we'll introduce shortly. We're about to move into a subtler terrain, how individual shifts in identification scale to collective patterns, and how a recalibrated internal broadcast changes what you notice in the world. But before we head there, I want to expand two more practical themes that make the first steps resilient. First, a micro-habit, thought classification in daily life. While the labeling and tracing are structured practices, classification is lightweight and continuous. Over the next 7 days, aim to classify 3 spontaneous thoughts each day as you go about life. They can appear during a walk, while replying to a message, or while warming your coffee. Your goal is to catch and categorize fast. Habit, future worry, comparison. This micro-habit applies the gap to the flow of daily living, preventing the insights from being relegated to formal practice only. Second, a social litmus test. Gently invite one trusted person to be a witness, someone you can tell, "I'm trying a noticing practice. Could you remind me if I get defensive?" The goal is not to outsource responsibility, but to create external feedback that accelerates learning. When other people reflect back patterns you're trying to shift, you can see whether your inner radio is still dictating your responses. Now let's talk briefly about mechanisms at a slightly larger scale, without overclaiming any mystical causality. Think of your internal state as a broadcast frequency. When you're identified with chaotic, story-driven thinking, your broadcast is fragmented, fast-changing, reactive snippets that attract similar content and situations. When you consistently inhabit the recognizing awareness, your internal signal becomes more coherent, steady, and receptive. You don't control external events like a puppeteer. Rather, coherence changes what you notice, the choices you make, and the way you show up. Those differences influence relationships, opportunities, and the micro-decisions that accumulate into larger life shifts. Some research streams have measured physiological correlates of coherent states. HeartMath, for example, has shown that heart rhythm coherence accompanies certain states of calm focus and emotional balance. These findings are suggestive. They indicate measurable shifts in the body's electromagnetic patterns during coherent states. Frame this as supportive context, not causal proof that consciousness broadcasts reality. What matters for you is the experiential and behavioral chain. Awareness shifts perception, perception shapes action, action influences outcomes. That is a causal chain you can test in your own life through carefully kept metrics. Which brings us to an essential tool for this work, the Reality Response Journal. This is a 30-day protocol designed to capture baseline data and track changes week by week. The point is to make inner shifts observable. A simple template: day, trigger, thought label, immediate felt intensity, 0 to 10, response chosen, outcome, and a one-line reflection. Spend 5 minutes each evening filling 2 simple entries, one where you identified with thought and one where you intentionally used the gap. At the end of each week, count the number of times you chose a different response than habitual and note any small external differences: more ease in conversation, less sleeplessness, a clearer creative idea. A sample journal entry might look like this: Day 7, trigger, email from manager, thought label, threat, intensity, 7, response chosen, pause and breathe, ask clarifying question, outcome, conversation focused, manager offered resources, reflection, noticed a memory of past criticism, pausing reduced adrenal spin, allowed curiosity. After week 1, you have a baseline of how often you default to identity-driven behavior. After week 4, you'll have comparative data showing whether intentional noticing correlated with different outcomes. There are 2 caveats in using the journal. First, don't use it as a tool for perfectionism. It's not an accountability device to beat yourself up. Use it as a microscope. Second, beware confirmation bias. You may start noticing results you expect. Mitigate that by including entries where you intentionally do the old reactive pattern and observe outcomes honestly. Break the habit of only recording victories. The full dataset is what reveals real trends. We're now nearing a pivot point in this conversation because the practices we've covered, brief noticing, labeling, tracing, anchoring, micro-classification, and journaling, create both immediate experiential differences and the scaffolding for deeper identity change.
The difference between a fleeting insight and a new baseline is the degree to which you practice these exercises with curiosity and gentleness rather than force. People often make 2 mistakes, trying to suppress thoughts, which produces the opposite effect, or interpreting early failures as proof that the method doesn't work. Neither is true. The work is iterative. The 60-second recognition is the opening chord. The practices are the melody you return to until the tune becomes familiar. Up to now, everything has been about creating a metacognitive gap. Next, we'll explore how that gap translates into real-world shifts, how a steady internal signal draws different opportunities, and how to track those changes in relationships, creativity, health, and finances. We'll also introduce a structured identity shift protocol you can run over 30 days. But before we step into those sections, I want you to take a short inward inventory right now. Recall a recent moment of automatic shame, defensiveness, or scarcity. Take about a minute to bring the memory into focus, note the associated bodily tone, label the thought, and see if you can identify a first source memory behind it. You don't need to solve anything, only notice. If this brought up strong feelings or images, anchor with a breath and remember that noticing is the first act of freedom. If it felt light and informative, note the ease. That's a data point too. Either way, record a brief line in whatever privacy tool you use, phone note, paper, whatever. This single act, notice, label, trace, record, moves the insight from idea into habit. It's the small daily move that, over weeks, rewires your internal broadcast. We're at the threshold of a deeper mapping, how to think about collective thought patterns and the sense of a field, how to classify thoughts into categories that help you disengage, and how to build a phased identity reconstruction that replaces I am my thoughts with I am the awareness noticing. The next segment will lay out the collective field hypothesis modestly, what we observe, how to test it, and concrete practices for disentangling your personal narrative from group echo. We'll also get more granular with the Reality Response Journal week-by-week protocol and introduce embodiment practices that anchor the new identity in the body. Before we continue, take one more slow breath and notice how your posture, chest, and face feel. There is already a different quality available to you, a small opening, the memory of being less fused to a voice. That opening is the lever. Use it, not as an intellectual experiment, but as the starting point for 4 to 6 minutes of daily practice that will change what you notice and, step by step, what life offers you in return. Now, prepare to move deeper. We will examine collective patterns, the classification of thought types that helps you disengage quickly, and the identity shift protocol that converts episodic insight into a sustained reorientation.
We'll move now into a slightly wider frame, how individual recognition scales into collective patterns, how to classify the kinds of thoughts that keep you entangled, and how to run a 30-day identity shift protocol that turns episodic insight into a durable baseline. I'll be precise with practices and timelines so you can test everything for yourself, and I'll keep the metaphors consistent. Radio stations, clouds, frequencies, so the mechanism stays clear. Start with a simple classification system I call Type 1, Type 2, Type 3 thinking. It's a fast mental triage you can use in the moment. Type 1 thoughts are immediate sensory-based reactions. Ouch! That smells bad. Loud noise. They're rooted in direct perception and usually require quick, pragmatic responses. They're neither right nor wrong, they're signal about the environment. Type 2 thoughts are habit loops and personally patterned narratives, replays of old dialogues, judgments, shame loops, perfectionist scripts. These are the thoughts that feel most like you because they carry emotional charge and repetitive structure. They often trace back to an origin memory or learned rule. Type 3 thoughts are collective or ambient narratives, cultural scripts, social anxieties, groupthink whispers that don't originate from a personal memory but from absorbed social context, the shoulds you never chose and the background hum of public opinion. These often arrive as generalizations or fears that seem bigger than your personal history. Practice classifying 3 spontaneous thoughts each day using this system for 7 days. In daily life, catch a thought, silently assign it type 1, 2, 3, and note one-word labels: sensory, habit, collective. The micro-skill of classification speeds metacognition because it orients you to whether the thought needs immediate action, gentle investigation, or polite distancing. After a week, you'll notice your inner radio getting an equalizer. You're distinguishing between channels faster, so the ones that used to pull you off course have less leverage. Now, the collective field idea. Frame it modestly. Imagine there are patterns of thinking circulating in your environment the way weather patterns circulate across a region. Individuals both contribute to and receive those patterns. Some research suggests there are measurable physiological correlations when groups shift states. Heart coherence studies, for example, at institutes like HeartMath, show consistent patterns of regulation when people practice coherence techniques. That doesn't prove that your thoughts broadcast literal commands into the universe. It suggests there are measurable signals associated with coherent states versus chaotic states. Practically, what this means is simple and testable. When you are less fused to anxious narratives, you stop echoing and amplifying them in your immediate environment. People around you receive a different signal, less reactivity, more steadiness, and they respond differently. This is not mystical causation, it's interpersonal feedback loops and attention economics. To disentangle personal narrative from group echo, run a 3-week collective detox experiment. Week 1, notice and label all Type 3 thoughts as ambient or echo. Don't argue or analyze, simply name them. Week 2, reduce exposure to the main sources you've noticed. News, particularly reactive social channels, angry group threads, by half. Replace that time with short awareness anchors. Week 3, test social interaction shifts. Observe whether conversations change when you enter them from a steadier baseline. Keep a simple count each day. Number of Type 3 labels, hours of lowered exposure, and 3 qualitative notes on conversational tone. This is empirical. Less ambient reactivity often correlates with clearer boundaries and less spread of anxiety. All of these experiments feed into the Reality Response Journal, which I'll now map out week by week with concrete templates and sample entries so you can begin immediately. The journal is the thing that turns subjective hunches into measurable data. You'll use it to compare baseline behavior to post-practice behavior. Before you begin, do a baseline week. For 7 days, do nothing different except observe and record. 2 entries per day are enough, one where you recognize you identified with a thought, and one where you acted without noticing the thought's presence. Record date, trigger, thought label, 1 word, type, 1, 2, or 3, intensity, 0 to 10, how energetic the thought felt, automatic response, actual outcome, and 1-line reflection. Sample baseline entry. Day 0, trigger, morning email from client, thought label, inadequacy, type 2, intensity 8, automatic response, retreat and draft a defensive response, actual outcome, email sent with defensive tone, reflection, felt smaller, assumed criticism, strained tone, increased conflict. You'll keep this baseline for a week to map habitual tendencies. On day 8, you begin the active 30-day protocol, and the journal structure shifts to include an experimental column, intervention used, label, tracing, anchor, response chosen, outcome, and comparative note. Was outcome materially different from baseline? The 30-day reality response journal protocol divides into 4 weekly phases with specific metrics. Week 1, foundation, labeling and anchoring. Continue 5 minutes of daily labeling, twice daily 10-minute awareness anchor sessions. Metric, count of labels per session, intensity reduction percentage, compare average intensity this week versus baseline, and 3 gap moments recorded in the evening entry.
Expected change, increased noticing, initial reduction in felt urgency of recurring thoughts. Sample week 1 entry. Day 12, trigger, partner asked about weekend plans, thought label, avoid, type 2, intensity 5, intervention, label plus anchor, response, paused, asked a curious question, outcome, calm planning conversation, comparative note, baseline would have withdrawn, today I stayed engaged. Week 2, investigation, source tracing and classification. Spend 10 to 15 minutes daily on tracing for 1 to 2 recurring thoughts. Continue micro-classifications in daily life. Metric, number of traced origin memories recorded and the rules identified that came from them. Expected change, cognitive maps of where rules originated, less automatic belief in those rules. Sample week 2 entry. Day 16. Trigger, presentation prep, thought label, I'll mess up, type 2, intensity 6, intervention, traced memory to age 9 classroom humiliation, response, rehearsed a simple opening line, outcome, first 5 minutes felt steady, comparative note, memory no longer felt like present authority. Week 3, social field adjustment. Reduce ambient exposure and test group interactions. Keep classification counts and note 3 social interactions where you intentionally maintained the anchor. Metric, hours reduced exposure, number of interactions with anchor maintained, subjective rating of conversational tone 1 to 10. Expected change, less escalation in group contexts, clearer listening. Sample week 3 entry. Day 22. Trigger, family group chat heated up. Thought label, need to defend. Type 3, intensity 7. Intervention, reduce exposure plus anchor. Response, did not engage. Outcome, avoided escalation. Comparative note, previously would have posted and prolonged argument.
Week 4, Embodiment and Identity Scripting. Identity Shift Protocol begins in earnest. Use identity statements and embodiment practices daily and track how often you can access the anchor during stressors. Metric: % of recorded triggers where you used the anchor, and a simple shift score that counts whether outcome differed from baseline. Expected change: beginning of a new default, more regular access to the gap, and more intentional responses. Sample Week 4 entry, Day 30, Trigger, Quarterly Review, Thought Label, Not Enough, Type 2, Intensity, 4, Intervention, Label plus Anchor plus I am script, Response, Offered constructive question, Outcome, review highlighted growth areas without criticism, comparative note, responses more collaborative. End of month synthesis, compile totals, labels per session average, traced origin memories, hours of reduced exposure, % of interactions with anchor used, and shift score trendline. This becomes your evidence base. The point is not perfection, the point is observable change. If the data is noisy, that's informative. If the data trends toward more frequent gaps and different outcomes, that's evidence that identity is shifting.
Let's make the Identity Shift Protocol practical. It runs 30 days and has 4 progressive phases that mirror the journal weeks, but framed as a personal rephrasing of self. Phase 1. Inventory. Days 1 to 7. Collect habitual stories into a list. I am not. I always. I never. Use your journal baseline. This is raw material, not judgment. The task is to be an archivist of internal narratives. Phase 2. Source investigation. Days 8 to 14. For the top 5 recurring narratives you identified, run the source tracing exercise. Find the earliest memory associated with each narrative and write a short note. Memory, implied rule, evidence for and against. This is data gathering. Phase 3. Awareness recognition. Days 15 to 21. Double down on anchors and labeling. Begin simple, brief I am re-scripting. Instead of I am not good enough, practice I am awareness noticing the belief of not enough. The phrasing matters. Place the content after a stable subject, I am awareness noticing, so that identity shifts toward presence, not a list of better-sounding attributes. Phase 4. Embodiment and consolidation. Days 22 to 30. Add short embodiment practices and integrate identity statements into action. Practice 3 situations where you deliberately step into the anchor and speak from that steadiness. Track 1 measurable behavioral test each day, e.g., 1 conversation where you choose curiosity over defensiveness, 1 task at work where you risk transparency, or 1 instance of checking a financial assumption before acting. Concrete scripts for rewriting I am statements. Old, I am anxious around money. New, I am the space noticing the thought that money equals danger. Old, I am a bad partner. New, I am the presence noticing the story that I am a failure. Old, I am not creative. New, I am the awareness noticing critical thoughts about my creativity. These rescripts are not affirmations meant to push away reality. They are identity reorientations that create a gap between the knower and the known. Use them fluidly, say them aloud in the morning, write them in your journal, and test them during interactions. Embodiment practices are essential because identity cannot remain purely cognitive. It must be felt in the body. Here are 3 embodiment techniques to anchor awareness in sensation and action. Grounding anchor. Stand with feet shoulder-width apart, soften knees, and feel the connection of feet to earth. Notice weight distribution and breath. Say silently, "I feel my feet. I am here." Use this when anxiety rises. The goal is to shift the center of gravity out of rumination and into direct somatic presence. Micro-movement reset. When you notice a thought spiraling, use a small movement. Uncurl hands, roll shoulders, take a deliberate step. Movement interrupts habitual neural loops and provides sensory data that competes with narrative. Over weeks, these resets become a habit loop that supports the anchor. Voice embodiment. Lowered, steady speaking engages the parasympathetic system. Practice reading your I am scripts aloud with a slightly slower tempo and lower pitch. That voice feedback will alter internal state and reinforce identity change. Combine these into a daily 20-minute integration sequence you can do each morning. Here's a practical, repeatable sequence that fits the daily integration requirement. Minute 0 to 5. Awareness anchor. Soft gaze, steady breath. Bring attention to being the space noticing. Label any strong thought that arises with one word. Record one line in your journal about the morning's most present thought. Minute 5 to 10. Movement and grounding. Do gentle movement, light stretches, 1-minute mindful walking in the room, or ankle rolls. Focus on sensation in feet and belly. Say the primary I am script 3 times aloud. Minutes 10 to 15. Source check micro session. Take one recurring narrative and do a 2 to 3 minute trace. What memory does this thought remind you of? Note it briefly. Do not analyze. Record data. Minutes 15 to 20. Intention setting and rehearsal. Imagine one real situation you might face today that usually triggers identity-based reaction. Rehearse responding from the anchor. Visualize noticing the thought, labeling it, and choosing a different response. Close by writing a single-line intention. Today, I will notice and pause before responding to criticism. Doing this 20-minute sequence daily reinforces the new default, awareness as baseline, not the continuous agreement with stories. If you want to go deeper, extend the time for anchor practice or add a 5-minute evening reflection. Now, concrete applications. How does this make a measurable difference in relationships, work, health, and finances? Use short vignettes as test cases you can replicate. Relationships. You notice a creeping judgmental thought. They never listen. Classify it as type 2, label blame, and anchor. Instead of launching into accusation, you say, "I'm noticing frustration. Can we explore what's happening?" The outcome? Calmer conversation and greater chance of being heard. Track instances where a pause led to an exploratory question rather than a defensive statement. Count them weekly. Work and creativity. When a sabotaging thought appears before a presentation, "I'm going to fail," label it forecast, trace to an origin quickly, anchor, and shift to a micro-action. Prepare the first 3 lines you'll say. Test whether you can present the initial part without ruminating. The measurable metric? Did you complete the presentation? Was your post-presentation reflection less catastrophic than baseline? Health and stress. Notice that catastrophic interpretation of bodily sensations, type 1 sensations quickly judged by type 2 beliefs, often escalate stress. Practice labeling bodily sensation neutrally, tightness, tingle, anchor awareness, breathe, and track sleep quality and perceived stress across 2 weeks.
This is not medical advice. If symptoms are serious, consult a professional. The practice reduces interpretation-driven stress responses in many people. Finances. Observe scarcity narratives. I never have enough. Classify as type 2 or type 3 depending on origin. Trace any personal memory that feeds it. Use a small test behavior. Instead of reacting to a money trigger by avoidance, open one bill or one financial document and read it with curiosity. Record the difference in felt intensity and next step clarity. Small, repeated experiments beat big promises. Across these domains, the mechanism is not magic, it's attention. When you shift where you put attention, away from habitual identification, you change the information you collect and the responses you choose. Over time, that changes patterns and opportunities because life is shaped by choices, and choices are shaped by attention. Let's address a common confusion. Does this mean thoughts stop? No, thoughts will keep arising. The key is whether you buy them as directives. The moment you stop automatically treating the voice as authority, you gain a practical leverage point. Reality doesn't rearrange because of a wish. Reality reorganizes because your perceived self no longer acts on automatic scripts. You notice paths you didn't before. You take different steps. The environment responds in ordinary, explainable ways. Next, practical troubleshooting. People often ask, what if I try this and nothing changes? First, check measurement. Did you keep a journal? Were you honest in comparing baseline to practice weeks? Second, check dosage. Many skills require repeated exposure. A 60-second test gives insight, but weeks of practice stabilize the new baseline. Third, check method. Are you trying to suppress thoughts? Suppression spikes the very patterns we're trying to loosen. The posture of curiosity, label, trace, anchor, produces data and leverage. Force produces rebound. If you find work is triggering and the anchor disappears under intense stress, use micro-anchors, a physical cue, a ring, a bracelet, a short phrase you associate with presence. Condition it by using it during calm anchor sessions. Over days, it becomes a quick retrieval cue in high-stress moments. Before we close, let me offer a condensed 7-minute practice you can do during a lunch break that combines everything. Sit or stand. Do a 1-minute noticing, observe thoughts, label quickly. Do 2 minutes of tracing for the most intense thought, find any memory. Do 2 minutes of anchor breath and repeat one I am script aloud 3 times. Spend the final 2 minutes picking one small action to take that contradicts the traced rule. This short sequence creates a micro-experiment. Notice, map, anchor, act. Now the synthesis and the practical decision point. The moment you stop identifying with thoughts, reality shifts automatically, not because of magic, but because your perceived self no longer acts on automatic scripts.
That gap produces different choices, different attention, and different feedback. It is immediate in felt experience. When you first notice, you feel unhooked, and it is cumulative in life outcomes when habits are changed. If you're ready to commit, here's the single thing to do next. Start the 30-day reality response journal today. Use the template you've heard in this talk, baseline week, then the 4-week progressive protocol. Track the metrics, labels per session, traced memories, hours reduced exposure, % of anchor implemented interactions, and your weekly shift score. At the end of 30 days, compile the data and reflect. Did you access the gap more often? Did responses differ? Use that evidence to iterate. If this message landed for you and you want practical support, subscribe to the guided series where I walk you through each week with short daily prompts and downloadable journal templates. Commit to the 30 days. Don't promise yourself perfection. Promise curiosity and small, consistent experiments. One final embodied invitation. Bring your attention now to your breathing. Notice the inhale, notice the exhale. Notice any thought that claims your attention. Label it once silently. Recall the memory of that first 60-second not thinking experiment you did earlier. Feel how distinct the noticing felt from the thought. Now, without changing anything dramatic, say silently to yourself, "I am awareness noticing this thought." Take 2 more breaths, letting the phrase settle as a felt quality rather than an idea. If you like, jot 1 line in your journal about what shifted. This is the hinge. Keep returning to it. The moment you stop identifying with thoughts, your internal signal steadies, your choices change. The world responds in ordinary, testable ways. Start today with 1 small experiment. Document it, and let the evidence guide you. If you want the templates and weekly prompts I mentioned, subscribe and download the Reality Response Journal to get started. Thank you for practicing presence with me. Keep noticing, keep recording, and keep testing.